The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to our webinar entitled The New Lobby Experience, Creating Safer Entrances for All People. Today's panel is sponsored by Guidepost Solutions and Boone Edom, both experts in the area of designing safe workplaces. For our participants, please use the chat room for submitting questions, and we will be asking and answering them at the end of the session. My name is Stephanie Douglas, and I am with Guidepost Solutions as the president of the firm's national security practice. I work with clients across a number of industries in providing practical help in the areas of security, investigations, and compliance. As you already know, and in light of the many changes brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, workplaces will be required to change dramatically to not only meet government mandates, but also to meet the needs of employees, customers, and the general public. Today's panel is comprised of experts in the field of security and design, and I look forward to hearing from them as they address this critical and timely topic. So let's get started with some introductions. Today's expert panel includes Nick Miller from Guidepost Solutions. Nick serves as the Regional Vice President of the Security and Technology Practice. Also with us from Guidepost is John Harris, who serves as a Senior Consultant. From Boone Edom, we have Robert Helena, Regional Sales Manager, and also J.C. Powell, Vice President of Sales. Now that we have introductions out of the way, let's walk through a brief overview of today's topics. Today, our experts will be discussing security and its impact on design, specific design considerations when developing today's lobbies, technology solutions, the use and implementation of touchless entry, and we will wrap up with a must-have guide and download. So let's begin our panel. Nick and John, over to you.
Hi, everyone. This is Nick. There is no solution for detection for COVID-19, and there's going to be a process in place for returning to work, and it's going to be really varied. We're seeing it now in the press that it's different in every state, it's different in different regions, so it's going to be very complex. But we're going to be focusing on today, what is the post-vaccine and the future lobby, and how do we address the things that we're finding out around in this COVID-19 atmosphere? What do we need to look at for design for that future lobby? So I think that a key element of this is that there's tools that we have had for many years, and we often see these tools applied in federal buildings. And these tools include everything from ventilation to processing people and having the right kind of elements in the space. And I think that those tools that we've previously been using in adding layers of security in our buildings become increasingly important as we see how our buildings are responding to this current crisis. And so with that, I wanted to turn it to John to talk about how we actually think about designing these different solutions.
Thank you, Nick. And as you mentioned, we're witnessing and participating in these phase changes. And while the environment that we're operating in today is uncommon and not like something we've experienced before, the inputs and fundamental controls remain consistent and constant. That being the people, process, and technology being those key factors to take into consideration when we're developing and designing the type of approach, whether it's a brand new building, whether we're retrofitting a building, whether we're adapting our entryways to the COVID situation or something different. And we use these fundamentals because, individually, they're very critical, but they have to work together and be contemplated when you're designing your access control and creating your entryway. And so from a people perspective, we're talking about all people accessing the building, or those you don't want to access the building. So employees, contractors, visitors, delivery personnel, anybody who you want in the space, that you want identified, and how you want them to enter. The processes, we're talking about the procedures, the protocols, the workflows, how are people entering, how are they being controlled, and what are the policies that they're having to adhere to. And then technology is our technology controls, whether it's access control, video, identity management solutions, mobile, Wi-Fi, all that adapting and coming together to create this ecosystem of security access control. And just as the base concepts and fundamentals and foundational principles we have here are not really unchanged, just reapplied. JC, when we look at what the concerns and challenges are and the potential issues that we deal with, those don't change a lot either. When we look at what are concerns we might need to consider when designing.
Yeah, you're right, John. There is a fundamental aspect around buildings, even if we go back just a little bit, of unauthorized entry into a facility. And it's always existed. And guess what? It's going to exist come post-COVID. Now, where I think that the inputs of the people, the process, and the technology designed together to work together is what is going to be a main component when you're thinking about how do you design the future lobbies. But one thing that you definitely need to understand is that not all security entrances are the same. But if you ask yourself that one important question of how many unauthorized people should be allowed into your facility, the answer should be 0, whether it was 6 months ago or 6 months from now, post-COVID-19. So what's interesting is, this fundamental aspect around tailgating. All it does is it creates a heightened risk to organizations. We all know it's happening. We've all held doors open for people, especially if inclement weather or if a lot of people are coming in. But recently we conducted a survey of over 200 security consultants and security end users. And there were a few facts that came out of this that were actually pretty surprising. More than half of those that were polled believed that a breach would occur in their facility. And when asked to estimate a cost of the result of that breach, it was listed at over $500,000, too high to measure when you think about the damage that could potentially happen to the brand, to that company of having somebody get in. Another interesting fact was that 74% of all respondents, they weren't even sure whether or not that their companies even tracked unauthorized entry. So when you think about that unauthorized entry, you're thinking about risk, and that risk is what's walking through the door, not just the person. And as we go into this future design of lobbies, where we're incorporating touchless and frictionless and utilizing social distancing, there are ways that you can do that. One simple solution would be, I just want to automate every door in my facility, put an automatic operator on it. Well, that is a solution, but with that and that door remaining open, you're allowing those risks to come in. And risk could be anything from theft or violence, civil lawsuits based on failure to provide duty of care. We all know that tailgating is an innocent action. It's often just polite to hold the door open. But Nick, I believe that in the midst of maintaining social distancing, it's more important now than ever to know who is in your building. And the use of security entrances will allow your design to mitigate these risks. Now, however, as we said, not all security entrances are built the same. But once you understand and know how to utilize them, you can plan the people and the processes with a much more great deal of accuracy without assumptions.
Well, JC, I think part of that is also understanding what level of security is appropriate. Now, in this current atmosphere, we're all focused on security, but is this going to hold true in the future? And our contention is that that there is this fundamental basic need to have security. And I question, how do we identify that? What is our process?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick, and you're absolutely right. And it's really not even a fundamental change, but just being able to weigh safety and security. When we're talking about those three inputs, the biggest thing that's in there is that middle component, and it's the processes that will have to be added in conjunction with people to all the technologies. When you look at security entrances, there's a wide array, and depending upon what the culture of the company is and how their processes and people fit in with that would determine whether or not you would use what we refer to as a deterrence strategy, such as a full height turnstile or a waist height turnstile, detection strategy, which is quite commonly used in the lobbies of office buildings, or in certain instances, a prevention strategy. Now, the big difference between these three strategies is the low and the medium, deterrence and detection, still require a manned presence because they are just doing that. They're detecting or they're deterring. Even though optical turnstiles have sensors, you still have the ability to tailgate through it. The biggest benefit with a prevention strategy, security doors, is it allows you to redirect those resources of your people to potentially help aid in some of these new processes as we go through. For architects, designing entrances can be a challenge. We know that no two entrances are the same, even in the same building. So, hey, Nick, can you share an example with our attendees to help them understand how a layered combination of entrance solutions could change within their new design?
Oh, absolutely. And when we look at holistically at an entire building, or in many cases a campus or the other site elements, it's important to see all these different entrances and look at the roles of the people that play in those different entrances. And so you've got visitors, you have employees, you have contractors, and we'll be talking about mail and packages. All this needs to be looked at holistically. And I think healthcare is a good example of that. And Robert, you've had some recent experiences with healthcare end users.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. This is Robert Elena with Bonino. Yeah, since standardization hasn't been achieved yet, I'm seeing a lot of different designs being considered. Let's look at a recent case study. The scenario is two hospitals dealing with COVID-19 in different ways. The first hospital is looking at screening outside of the actual building. They're using a robust visitor management system. They're thinking about installing optical turnstiles for patient access. There's also thinking about installing security revolving doors for their staff. Now let's take a look at another hospital under these same conditions of COVID-19. They're looking at having the screening done inside the lobby. They're also thinking about installing turnstiles for patient access, especially for elevator banks. And they're also thinking about installing optical turnstile entrances for their staff. So you can see two different organizations in the same industry designing two different approaches. So Nick, what does this really mean about the future lobby experience?
So it really requires us as designers, as safety and security advisors and professionals to come together and think in a holistic manner about the entire experience of people entering the building. Everything from where they're getting off from transportation, from the parking experience, from visitor parking, all of that, bicycles, all of that needs to be looked at. How do people come to the building? how do we manage the identity of these people? How do we create potentially separate entry points? And I think that a lot of times we just kind of mix everybody up into the lobby experience. And what we're saying is maybe that's not always appropriate. Maybe it's, especially when we try to create enough space to have all these other functions going on, that lobby experience maybe should be focused just on the visitors and not on the employees. And there's a different experience for the employee or the pre-vetted person. So we feel it's critical to think holistically. You know, every vertical is going to have different needs. A data center is different than a hospital, and a hospital is different than education or corporate building. So all these will have different culture, as JC, you were talking about. We need to be able to pivot and deal with the roles of the people that we're dealing with. And again, go back to these fundamentals of providing the physical controls, the identity management controls, and the space to make all that work. And one of the areas that often is forgotten, John, is shipping and receiving.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. And I've seen this real time with a couple of end users that we're working with, specifically on helping them develop their approach on responding to COVID, creating their operations through the constraints today, and then going forward across that continuum that we opened up the presentation with. And often what they've identified is that you know, either they, from the beginning when their facility was originally designed, they didn't take into consideration or contemplate how they were going to manage post and package screening. And so we've done assessments with these clients previously where we've asked how they do that, and UPS just comes in and drop everything off in the lobby. Well, maybe it works for them today. It's a little bit inconvenient, but they manage through it. You know, the receptionist might sort the mail and then send it up and walk around. Well, now think about how you would manage that in today's world. You want to mitigate interaction between people. You may want to sanitize and wipe down the packages as they're coming in. You may want to screen them for, there's actually, there's a technology that's being developed with the intention to be able to screen packages and other items for any trace amounts of COVID or other types of diseases or things that could be on them. The original design intent for these was for anthrax and Ebola and other kind of mail-borne items that would be used as more of an attack mechanism. But the application is being considered for this type of application as well. And so if you haven't designed the space for it, or even looked at the process or who's going to manage it, back to that people process technology, trying to shoehorn that into your operation after the fact is going to be very challenging. So I think when we look at and we can't predict the future, and so we won't say that all of a sudden comprehensive technology-driven mailrooms are going to become par for the course in new building design. I would say that how non-people things like deliveries, even food and other items that come into a building are being brought in, entered, processed, should be a contemplation regardless of whether we're in the midst of the pandemic or thereafter. I think it's something that should at least influence design, and whether it's in the lobby or somewhere else, is definitely an important factor going forward.
And that takes us to really the technology package. And one of the things that we feel is really important is that technology not be looked at as the solution. It is a supporting mechanism for the process. And John, back to what you were talking about before, this idea of having these processes in place and this understanding of business needs. How do you see that driving these technology solutions?
Yeah, and to your point, Nick, they're not a silver bullet. So you can't just choose one, put it in, and solve your problem. In regular circumstances, that would be a bad idea. Again, considering the processes and the people together with the technology and how it's all going to intermingle. under these circumstances, it's even more of a challenge because based on the research that's available today around COVID, there's no one symptom that is completely a standalone identifier of a positive COVID case, meaning most people have fevers, but not all. I can take over-the-counter medication in the morning and reduce my fever and therefore make temperature screening totally non-usable. So utilizing that alone, just throwing up a thermal camera and saying I'm good is not going to address your issue. But if you have that plus you're doing a virtual questionnaire of people before they come in, and you're layering some of these other technologies together, and we're going to get into a little bit later about integration and analytics and how those all tie together. But I guess the takeaway here is that there's no brand new solutions that are solving these new problems. There's the compilation of existing technologies that are now being pushed forward and reapplied to this new issue that, when working together in concert, can give you a very, very good layered security approach. And I think going forward, our designs, specifically lobby designs, have to take these into consideration, not just for the footprint that they might take up, but how it's going to impact your process flow, or you need to design the process flow to can take these into consideration. And I'll give you a real-time example, Nick. We were working with a pro sports team that was, we were the security consultant helping them design their the security components of their training facility. And we get a bit of a frantic call from them a couple of weeks ago. Hey, do we need to put thermal in? We're about to go pens down on our design. We're breaking ground, like this thing's getting going. And do we need thermal in the design for this training facility? And so after a couple of conversations with them and talking to them about how the athletes are going to enter, how the trainers are going to enter, like how all that process flow works, we also said, well, do you envision doing this forever? Well, we don't know the answer to that. Okay, well, so should we put in a permanent design component into a building for something that we don't know that you're going to do forever, and that you don't really even have a process for how you're going to deploy it today? So where we landed was putting in electrical outlets and data drops in strategic locations in the entry point, so that if we wanted to put temporary thermal screening in place, we would not have to, run, data lines and Ethernet and extension cords across the lobby. We could at least plug them in and use them there. And then obviously there's other uses for that. If they had a family day or they had other things where they had to put up digital signage or whatever, they'd add some additional value for the user, and doesn't get them stuck with an architectural design that could be non-useful and just get in the way in the future.
Well, thanks, John. And one of the fundamentals, JC, that we've always seen in this is the turnstile, and that hasn't gone away.
No, and it won't, or shall I say it shouldn't go away, Nick, because again, knowing who's in your building with the processes, the pre-screenings, the templates, all these technologies that can be used ahead of actually getting past that point of security, getting to that secure side of the lobby or the building, is going to remain critical, probably even more so now, because you've got people in masks and you've got people that are, facial features are distorted. I understand there's technology that can mitigate that. But what I would like, the architects that are on the line and the end users to think about is, as you're preparing future designs or future layouts, you don't have to get away from what you would have done previously. There are ways to still incorporate social distancing. For instance, here you can see a nice entrance into an elevator bank with 4 lanes. Now, that 4 lanes was calculated on the occupancy of the building, to match the throughput to get employees into and out of work in a timely manner. Now, as we go through these stages of, 2 and 3, return to work and post-vaccine, even though those occupancy levels may be less, at some point we will get back to some sort of normalcy where more and more people are in the buildings. And in my honest opinion, it would make sense to prepare your entrance for occupancy, but then in this example, close down alternate lanes to provide that social distancing. Then when you need it for flow, all you have to do is turn them back on. And where that really benefits the ultimate end user is they don't have to incur additional costs to do it again. You don't have to tear up the floor, run more electrical, buy more equipment, all of that. So, you know, you can space them out. You can put one on one side, one on the other, but just you have to understand when you do get back to whatever the new normalcy will be with building occupancy, you're going to need to maintain your traffic flows. And, you know, John, to the point you just made about the sports team and the additional technologies that could be used, whether it's temporary or permanent, you have to take into those considerations. So you had mentioned the temperature screening, John. So how do you think that that would impact, you know, these entrances going forward?
It's a great question. And as I mentioned, there are some considerations for what the technology does and does not do. And, you know, one thing about Guidepost, you know, we're an independent consultant. We don't sell product. And so when we're looking at something like this, we're looking at it strictly on the specification, the performance, and the accuracy, and whether or not, frankly, we would put it in. Many of us being end users and architects in our previous components of our career, you know, that's the lens we're looking at it. So, and what's important to take into consideration is that the information is becoming more clear and clearer over time, meaning we're learning more about COVID, what it is, what it isn't, and we're learning more about how these technologies can and cannot be applied. Within the last couple of weeks, the FDA came out with some additional guidance where they specifically call out what shouldn't and should be done with the technology. They talk about how, quote unquote, mass scanning is not effective. So these technologies where, you know, we're going to put it outside and let 30 people walk by and somehow magically point out the person that may or may not have a fever, is just practically not reasonable. And so getting back to our original conversation around the people, the processes, and technology, knowing that is going to provide the deployment of this technology is going to have some maybe capability constraints that are going to impact your processes, meaning if you're going to screen 100% of your people at a single lobby, it could turn your throughput time from, you know, 100 people every 20 minutes to 100 people every 2 hours. And that's where you may contemplate, all right, well, like we've talked about before, do we need to put visitors, contractors, employees into different spaces? Using healthcare as an example, because that's an area that we in Guidepost have been working in as well. We've been talking to healthcare organizations about distributing the entry points of who does what, meaning who comes in. Our doctors are pre-screened and you know, are being checked at home before they come in, and therefore, you know, lower risk. So they come through a different entry point. You know, doctors, nurses, et cetera, and visitors come through the front. Do you have an entryway just for folks who are coming in to be screened for COVID? And you know, historically, the security mindset has been mitigate the entry points, have everybody come through one place, because then you know who's coming in. It's easy to control, and we're turning that on its head a little bit and looking at distributing. But in doing so with this, you would have to potentially have temperature screening at all those different places. So it's one of those things where it has its place, like I discussed before, as one layer, one tool in the toolbox. But in and of itself, you know, it's not a standalone solution, and you just have to appreciate what areas that, you know, it might not be able to do. And Nick, similarly, you know, thermal's been around for a long time, deployed for very different purposes up until this. Same thing with touchless technology, and that's now coming to the forefront and something that's being, you know, adapted, I think, at much larger rates than we've seen historically.
That's right, and Robert, you've dealt with a lot of these touchless solutions. You know, we mentioned different verticals. You know, we've seen these highly secure turnstiles deployed regularly in data centers. But what are you seeing in the world of full height security turnstiles in lobbies. They certainly help with the building envelope and HVAC control. What other things where are we seeing these deployed?
Yeah, we're seeing them deployed in a lot of different verticals, Nick. We've been approached by many technology partners and end users requesting information and interconnection requirements for all these different touchless technologies. You know, what's really interesting is that for the past years, frictionless has been the popular buzzword in the access control industry, right? So now it's like COVID-19 is pushing us to frictionless access control environment faster than the industry is really ready for. So we're getting a lot of requests around automated contactless entry, contactless credentials, like John was talking, the thermal cameras and the sensors. How do we integrate, how do we interconnect touchless technologies like biometrics, mobile apps, automation with door systems, automated elevator dispatch. I think one of the big takeaways that we're noticing is that all these technologies can be interconnected to optical turnstiles and security revolving doors. Also, I mean, customers today are being bombarded with various technology options, Nick. In your opinion, you know, how are these customers going to sort through all these different technologies and risk, you know, and reduce the risk of these expensive knee-jerk solution decisions?
Well, again, Robert, it's going back to this fundamental principle of understanding your operational business needs, understanding the threats and the assets within your facility. Because again, every vertical is different. So, and understanding that, then we can actually vet what is going to work and what is a process. If you have 5,000 people entering a building, it's going to really drive a different solution than if you have 500 people entering the building. So those are the fundamental considerations that have to drive the selection of the technology. And then I think there's a fundamental one that we've been talking about that really plays a key role, and that is identity management. And John, what's your experience been in the identity management world?
Similar to the contactless, frictionless, historically it's been a little bit of a niche product or solution that large enterprise customers or those organizations where digital identity and physical identity are being merged and converged, that's been a consideration. What we're seeing now, though, is the opportunity to utilize it as a mechanism for virtualizing your lobby and pushing a lot of those conventional processing processes that you would bring in visitors, contractors, employees that need replacement badges, things like that, out to the pre-visit phase, so that you could distribute a request for a visitor to come in via email. The credential could be sent to them either via RFID in an email, or if there's a credential over a phone app or something like that. There's questionnaires that can be sent digitally so that you can vet folks before they come in, whether it's your employees who have to opt in to being healthy, meaning before I'm going to come into work each day, I'm going to say, I haven't had a fever, I haven't been in contact with anybody, I feel fine. I'm going to click, send, and that's going to activate my credential for the day. So there's the ability to then take that data and do interesting analytics, which I'll get into a little while later. But I think the real takeaway here is, how do you virtualize and move the visitor or lobby experience out of the physical premises, and therefore mitigate or eliminate the need to be physically in that area for long periods of time.
Well, John, that seems like can be a win-win, because the actual visitor experience can be improved because it's an easier and quicker process. It can become a hands-free process using these remote credentials on phones. And there is space considerations. I know we're working on a new lobby design, and we're adding a little space for kiosks, and as opposed to just having everything up at the receptionist desk. So there's solutions here that seem to be working well, but all of this hinges on really integration. and integrating these various, often disparate systems into something that's, again, solves these process and the operational requirements. So in healthcare, we've seen, which is rampant with lots of technology, we're seeing, asset tracking. Well, that was same asset tracking systems that may be looking at a blood pressure machine and also be connected to nursing staff and doctors, that can actually do social distancing. So we may see more RFID in the future, but we need to plan our buildings to be able to support that kind of infrastructure. And so there needs to be the appropriate backbones to be able to support RFID. So again, technology and integration of these systems. Do we want to have the destination elevator destination display in those turnstiles? And I would say if the turnstiles are close to the lobby and to the cabs, it works really well and it's efficient. But when the space design doesn't really support that, then people can't remember what cab they're supposed to get in by the time they get through the turnstile. So all those really complex integrations need to be thought through, and it's an important part of what we're doing. And then around, again, that silver bullet around AI, we get so many requests. Why can't we just put in a camera and solve all this and tell everyone, hey, you were too close to someone? But where is AI now, and where is this intelligence in the video world?
And as you mentioned, we put all this technology together, and if we do it thoughtfully with integration in mind, it's going to become an extremely data-rich environment, which can be used in different ways, both for preventative and reactive research and data gathering. With analytics, that allows us to take the data and tell us what it sees. So, for instance, using social distancing and applying video analytics to identify distance, or being able to, if you envision drawing circles around individuals that are of a 6-foot radius as they walk through your space, there's analytics programs that can tell you, are people interacting into each other's social distancing bubble? And you could use that as an analytic to say, am I putting too many people in this space at one time? And how can I either change my throughput, slow people down, move people into other spaces? You could use it reactively to send someone down there to man this space and tell people, to spread apart. You could put stanchions, you could change the configuration. You could also use that data if you were going to design a space in the future for a similar application. Let's say you're doing an airport design, and in a previous airport, you had that analytic capability of looking how the check-in area works. And you could take that information and change your design, or confirm that that's the right design based on the analytics that you've done previously. AI and machine learning, a little bit of a different animal. With AI, you're trying to develop the capability for it to be able to make human-like decisions. So take input in and react to it. So you may have it input some information and then respond to it. So notify someone of something, or shut down a door if this type of alert happens, and create that type of smart environment. There's been a lot of discussion around smart buildings and how those could interact with one another, and how AI could be used to enable those IoT devices that interact. And in doing so, in kind of a COVID convention, you could see how you could plug and play those things together. And similar application to machine learning, where you take the information you have, you feed it in, and you use algorithms to compute it and learn from what your environment is doing, and make either security operational decisions based on it, or change your design outputs for future projects that way.
So moving on, we've got processes and in place, but we have compliance issues as well. And really briefly here, we need to, whatever we design, support our risks and the safety of our people coming into these buildings. So I think COVID-19 has raised our awareness of these compliance elements, but we still have fundamental things that need to be met. and briefly, the data collection, whether it's in Europe or specific areas in the U.S., the personal protective equipment, and fundamentally all the training and response. So compliance is a critical area, and we're going to have to meet those obligations. And John, what are the key ones that you're seeing right now?
Well, to your point, I think the privacy considerations are front of mind, and HIPAA is being tiptoed around a little bit right now as we're talking about thermal and collecting potential symptom information. That's in direct conflict potentially with how HIPAA is written and how those types of information have to be controlled and protected. And so we could see either some sort of reconciliation between the way that those compliance regulations are written, or some stringent privacy requirements of what you can and cannot ask people to do. You mentioned GDPR. There's a couple states in the U.S., California, Illinois, and Texas being three of them, that have very similar privacy constraints in their laws on the books, biometrics on those as well. So right now, thermal isn't really indicated as a biometric, but if you are doing, like we talked about, the contactless access control, and you're using my hand plus my thermal, and you're asking me if I'm sick, have you combined enough information where you might trip those issues, and how are you managing it? How are you controlling it? And what are the fallouts from that? So the short answer is that we don't really know yet, and it feels like it's going to take something in the legal courts to play out before we know, but it definitely should be a thought for what you're collecting and how you're processing it and controlling it.
Well, Robert, I know that a lot of folks on the call probably are interested. Well, I have an existing building. I mean, what do I do with an existing building? Because not all buildings, as JC said, are the same.
Right, right, Nick. Most of the time, security executives look to entry experts when they have entrance concerns. Right, they ask us to work with their security teams to master technologies and processes to reduce unauthorized access, especially now when we're talking about reentry and COVID-19 phases, right? So one of the ways we do this is by performing both a physical or a virtual entry evaluation. So the purpose of these evaluations is to define the use of entry around the business process. It's also based around, what are the customer's current needs, right? What are their drivers? Is this really a reentry plan? Is this an active shooter? Is this a compliance need? Is this a security breach? Things of that nature. We always, at the end of the day, it's really looking at the current environment towards the desired state, right? The methodology that we use is both a physical and virtual approach. In the past, a lot of these evaluations were done in person. Now we're getting more requests around virtual given the reentry and COVID-19. What that means is that we're looking more at floor plans and pictures and FaceTime and video conferencing. Either way, both in-person and virtual evaluations are viable. The framework that we use is around the problem, cause, and solution approach, right? And at the end, we deliver a detailed report that is based on best practices. We think these evaluations are a good starting point when you're looking at the new lobby design. It's a great way to design the entrance for people, processes, and technologies, as we've been mentioning throughout the presentation. So we do recommend to consider this option when you are in that design process.
Thanks, Robert. And to recap, we really want to go through these critical things that we first talked about, which is there needs to be entrance controls. There's some good standards around doing that. Or should they maybe now be touchless entrance control? Should we provide more of that? That really, I think, makes sense. It's good for the user experience. It's good for the lessons that we've learned from this pandemic. There's the identity management piece. That's not going away, and it's going to have increasing emphasis. There's the technology solutions as well, but we still need to design the space to support all the processes that are appropriate. So, that reception desk, there's still going to have to be some person and interface to people in the visitor experience. We can find solutions that can be, if you will, not staffed by using higher security type doors that JC talked about. But when there's that interaction with people, we need to have the people interaction and design for that. And then finally, layer the technology solutions that are appropriate for the given circumstances. So with that said, we'd like to wrap it up.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick, for the recap, and thanks to all of our panelists. Participants, please take a moment to jot down the web addresses at the top of the page so that you can download some free content bundles. We've also included emails for John Harris and Robert Elena, so should you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to them. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out a copy to all registrants tomorrow. The slide will stay up at the end while we ask some questions. So we do have a few questions, and I know we're up against the time, but if our panelists will indulge a few questions. First of all, how do you see multi-factor access control changing in the lobby of the future? Anyone want to take a shot at that question?
Well, let's first take a definition of multi-factor access control. I'd like to take a pass on what defining multi-factor. So I'm assuming that means different technologies being used as part of the access control. And if John, you have any other thoughts on multi-factor, chime in. But I would say that we're seeing the change in what is the credential could dramatically impact that lobby experience. Just as we were talking about how the mobile phone can be the check-in device for a visitor and really help that experience in the speed of that check-in process. We need to accommodate that from a technology and a space planning standpoint, but also the phone itself can be the credential and unlock doors. It can unlock gates from 30 feet away. So a lot of changes can happen as we look at the changing of the credential. So I see that as multi-factor. I see biometrics as multi-factor and being able to identify, as we had in one of the slides, a hand geometry reader. It's called the wave reader. You wave your hand through, just like you're sliding your hand across the tabletop. You just slide your hand through the reader. Doesn't touch anything. We just did a retrofit for the Willis Tower the previous Sears Tower in Chicago with all biometric readers on the turnstile. So I think that is a changing aspect.
Hey Nick, can I add something to it? This is JC. In the world of security entrances, where multi-factor authentication really comes into play, is when you use a card reader or a biometric device or any type of actuation on a swing door, you get the registration of the activation, but what you don't capture is that somebody actually entered, actually went through. There's no technology on that swing door other than a closed door contact, but it doesn't prove that anybody actually went through it. So when you're thinking about future parts of the buildings and wanting to make sure that people aren't gaining access into an area that they need to be quarantined or something along those lines, prevention strategies, the high security doors, which when you badge on the outside and you step on the inside, you present your biometric, your dual authentication, then you actually get the return signal that somebody actually entered that space. So that's where we see the multi-factor component come into play.
I think there's also interpretation of multi-factor being like two-factor authentication. So again, to the mobile phone as a solution, that essentially in most iterations actually has two-factor authentication built into it, so that you've already used your finger to log into either the application or the phone itself. So I think the whole idea of identity management and doubling down on who people are is going to increasingly become important.
Great. Just kind of as a follow-up, we do have a question about a touchless credential. Instead of moving to a bio credential, is there one in a multi-factor authentication that could be touchless as opposed to bio?
This is John. I think I'm aware of a couple mergings of those technologies where you may still use, there's a card that's available on the market that actually uses a Bluetooth technology, so BLE reading, and it can be upwards of 15 feet away from the reader, usually closer to 5 is the distance it's used, and the biometric is actually kept on the card. And so that actually addresses a couple things, because it keeps you from having to touch anything, then you still have that two-factor, multi-factor authentication that's happening on the credential. So it's activated by my fingerprint on the card or my thumbprint, and then it actually garners its energy from the card reader, and then nor I nor it have to touch anything as I pass through it. So so you are getting that touchless, frictionless, without storing your biometric anywhere. It's only on the card, and it's locked in for your use only. So it's connected to you as the individual. No one else can use it because no one else has your fingerprint. So that's a way to stay away from the storage of biometrics, but still use that as an authentication factor.
Great, thank you. All right, so this will be our last question, and we can, again, thank you again for all the time that the panelists have taken, and to our many participants. We will be sending out the information to you tomorrow, but with one final question. Are we going to be required to ascertain whether vaccinations are being administered before people can enter the building? Obviously, a very timely question. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, this is John. I can give you my opinion, and then what's real time, and then maybe how that will change over time. So I think from an employee perspective, an employer, I find that more likely that an employee and employer relationship could allow for that request to take place, where you could say, and even I'm working with a couple of employees that are funding that themselves, that part of their process for bringing people back to work, their essential personnel, is sending them kits or sending them to clinics where those kits can be taken. So we are seeing that taking place. I feel that that'd be a little bit more challenging to manage in just a public space, where you'd have to wear some sort of identification or have some proof of testing. That might be harder to manage. So I think it's really going to depend on the type of entry point. You may be asked the question and have to respond to it as part of a questionnaire, and maybe that changes the way you're handled as you enter the site. But at least that's my 2 cents. But the rest of the panelists, if you have anything to add or other perspectives on it, please.
Well, and I think, John, you mentioned earlier there's a conflict currently with HIPAA and what our country and our societies need to do as far as understanding our status from a health perspective. And so I think fundamentally that's going to have some resolution. It may be in the courts, it may be in other means, but there are conflicts around this topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Thank you again to all of our panelists and our participants. And for those of you who registered for the webinar, you'll be receiving a copy of materials tomorrow. And again, thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.